It's now been a bit over 1 month since the release of the Until Dawn remake. The launch was not optimal to say the least, especially on PC. Besides technical issues that took some time to get patched with new bugs appearing now and then, the reception was generally not good. Reviews were mostly mediocre, player numbers were very low on Steam. As a matter of fact, the original PS4 saw an increase in players, but most importantly, people were disappointed. Disappointed in the fact that despite it being a remake, there wasn't really that much new to it. We had an extended prologue, a new ending, and just some new collectibles, but people were simply expecting more. Again, I was just glad to have Until Dawn as a whole on PC, on the one hand because I could finally play it, and on the other hand what comes with a game being available on PC. Due to the Until Dawn build finally making its way onto PC, the doors were finally wide open for a deep dive into the files and a whole lot more. I'm already working and will be releasing a separate video throughout the week that focuses on things like mods, camera hacking and all of that stuff. Today I want to focus on the things that I already made 3 videos about, and that is the cut dialogue found in the game files. As explained in each video, very talented Reddit users took the time going through so many voice lines in the game files to find and highlight the ones that never made it into the full game. And those lines, this cut dialogue has basically existed for decades. The fact that these lines were found shows that Ballistic Moon really used the original build, because they obviously didn't bother removing those unused lines from the final files. Like mentioned, I already made 3 videos that highlight and showcase those individual unused dialogues that were cut from the main game. This video is supposed to be a discussion, but even more so an analysis of said dialogue, and ask 3 questions. 1. Why was the dialogue cut? 2. What does the cut dialogue imply for what the story could have been? And 3. Should the remake have included them or not? There was a total of around 20 minutes of unused dialogue found in the files so far. Who knows, we stumble upon more one day, and it varies drastically from just an extra joke to implying some once planned scenarios that would have drastically changed things up. So let's look at this unused dialogue once more together and see what could and maybe should have been. A huge majority of the cut dialogue can be found within the first few chapters. You got a cut phone call between Sam and her mom, alongside Sam talking about each character on the bus. This cut dialogue and several conversations between Sam and Chris, between Sam, Chris and Jessica, just Chris and Jessica, but also Chris and Josh, and Sam, Chris and Josh. I'm talking about like, what, 6 minutes here? There's even more early game dialogue that wasn't used, such as between Matt and Emily when they first arrive, a whole lot of unused dialogue between Mike and Jessica in chapter 2 and chapter 3, and obviously a lot of unused lines in the fight between Emily and Jessica. Now, there is a reason why such a big chunk of the cut dialogue is found within the early chapters, and there's honestly a very simple explanation as to why it was cut. Timing. Now, video games usually don't have to worry about having to keep a specific time slot. When we look at TV shows or just live shows in general, there's spots that you need to hit yet you can't be even a second above. Things need to flow perfectly and on point. Video games usually don't have such restrictions and can technically throw in as much as they want. And Until Dawn as a single player story game isn't that long either. Nonetheless, it's also not a huge open world game, and instead a chapterized story with a lot of different segments flowing back to back. Choice-based story games like this are all about the individual set pieces, playable moments, and how each segment flows into one another. It's not like Resident Evil, because here besides big cutscenes and boss fights, you also have a lot of free roaming and hours of proper gameplay. Until Dawn is more of an interactive movie. Because of that and the fact that a good portion of the playthrough would be spent with leaning back and watching, there actually had to be attention paid to how each segment is written and ultimately finalized. The only game for any supermassive game is always used for character introductions, setting the tone, building up. The reason why so much dialogue was not used here is simply because they didn't want to blow these first 2 chapters even further. Until Dawn doesn't really start up until the start of chapter 4. Before that, it's all building up our character and set pieces for the mid-game. So they simply deemed those unused lines as unnecessary, or even simpler put, too much. I saw a lot of people say that as cool as the additional dialogue in Emily and Jessica fight is, it does drag on for a while. Same for those additional lines between Mike and Jessica. The segments are already quite slow as it's just them walking around, so there's really no need to squeeze in another 2 minutes of them talking, especially when you look at what those lines actually say. Most of it isn't really necessary. Not necessarily unnecessary, but also just not necessary. Some are additional jokes, some are just okay, but nothing crazy. When Matt and Emily first arrived, they talk for like, what, 30 seconds? There's 3 minutes of unused dialogue for that segment alone. Usually the actors are given like 15 lines, though only 10 lines will likely be included. They record all of them, and then the devs just pick out the 10 lines that they seem the best and most important. At least it's like this for those free roam segments where you can wait around a little and hear them talk more, or just skip most of it by going directly where you need to be. Dude, I'm so stupid. I just realized I can just put the script like below the camera instead of like left to it. I'm so dumb. Having some extra lines in the conversations between the characters is certainly welcomed, but it's not like the early chapters were truly missing dialogue. I feel like a lot of people were never really complaining about wanting more in those specific early game segments. It's just that now that they know there are some extra lines to those specific segments, that they're saying they wish they were added, especially in hindsight of a remake. But just like the Supermassive Games devs, Ballistic Moon simply didn't deem those lines necessary to be added. That would have made for a cool, hold on, that's new moment, but they weren't needed in the original, so they simply didn't use them now as well. It's a combination of not trying to bloat a segment with too much dialogue, while carefully picking what lines to be included in the end. Simple as that. I understand that as longtime fan, people want as much as possible, just more and more of those characters, but this is still a video game at the end of the day, and it's understandable why these lines didn't make the final cut. It's good bonus material, but just not needed in the actual game. Same goes for some examples in the late game as well. There was some cut dialogue between Sam and the Psycho in Chapter 5 where any additional lines would have hurt the pacing of the segment, similar to how there's like a minute of cut dialogue for Chris in Chapter 8 with the stranger. Same for cut dialogue between Ashley and Chris in Chapter 6, which would only have bloated things up. It's about prioritizing what you want people to hear. There was a cut line for when Emily arrives at the lodge in Chapter 8 where she just further explains how the tower fell. Just not needed. You have that moment where Mike and Wolfie find the other wolf's dead body. There's like 30 seconds of extra dialogue here that is reduced to a quick line in the final game. More than enough. Just like how they cut a quick dialogue between Sam and Mike when escaping the sanatorium, simply because it wasn't needed. I think you get the point by now. Before we move on to some dialogue that actually had some big implications, I want to address the elephant in the room. As many people pointed out, a huge majority of the cut dialogue happened to involve Jessica. Given her status as the overlooked and underused character, this obviously made additional room to discuss why the devs just didn't want to put her more into the spotlight, especially in hindsight of this being a remake, which usually tries to fix such things. Not only do I want to remind you that the idea of the remake was never to heavily change up the original story, but also that this isn't really the issue. The problem with Jerica's character does not dawn off of lack of dialogue and will not be fixed by adding 10 new lines into the game. Jessica is a character asserted by the fact that she always disappears at the start of Chapter 4 and either dies or won't be seen again up until the final hour. Up until Chapter 4, Jessica was literally amongst most seen and used characters, present every chapter, lots of dialogue and focus on her and Mike. It's always been the fact that she's used as a plot device in every alternation of the story, no matter what. Either she dies or survives, result is the same. Adding this cut content does not fix her character. Again, it would have been a cool bonus, but it wouldn't change anything about her status, nor was it really needed. Like mentioned, they didn't want to bloat those early segments with Sam, Chris, and Mike, and that cut dialogue between Matt and Jessica on the mines, it's kind of funny, but because of that, doesn't really fit the tone of the scene. Like what? Jessica's at 10% barely moving, yet she starts joking with Matt about racing back to the lodge? Come on. Again, I understand where people are coming from, and that especially Jessica happens to have so many lines removed is kind of very on the nose, but in order to fix the rock, there needs to be so much more than adding this cut dialogue. Now, let's look at some other segments that had dialogue removed where the implication is much more interesting. On the one hand, there were a few lines cut from the prologue, which indicate that Chris was originally supposed to be present during the prank, And that is really interesting. One of the big plot points of Chris is the fact that he was not present during the prank, yet still ended up receiving so much from Josh throughout his revenge. I find it really fascinating that at one point Chris was supposed to take part in the prank after all. When was this recorded? Because again, so much builds up of the fact that Chris is basically the most innocent friend regarding the accident. Those lights existing means that wasn't the case at one point and would heavily alter the arc that Chris went through. The arc of being punished despite being the least deserving of it. What do you think? Was this line a very early draft and they quickly changed plans and made Chris the innocent friend of the group? It would make sense given that the prank and prologue was amongst the first things they worked on. Still very interesting that such an important character arc was at one point not present. Let's go to Emily. Two of her biggest segments are the fight with Jessica chapter 2 and the fire tower conversation with Matt that turned really ugly really quick. While some of the insults thrown in the Jessica fight were just maybe a bit too much, Jessica also said that Emily sent naked pictures to Mike. During the fire tower argument, there was cut dialogue to clearly indicate that Emily cheated. Like we already have that "so you fucked him" line in the game, which can be said given the right circumstances, that isn't new, but with cut dialogue, Emily literally admits to it, saying that she made a mistake that she wished she could take back. She wasn't sure how to feel about Matt yet and doesn't want to be with Mike anymore. That is honestly kinda heavy. Like before that it was always just looked at Matt being jealous and interpreting too much into what seemed to be just Mike and Emily greeting each other. But with that cut Jessica line, and this? Now, there's two things we need to remember though. Number one, if it's cut, it's not canon. There's a reason these lines didn't make it into the final game. Yes, they were obviously thought about at one point, otherwise they would have been recorded, but if it's not in the final game, it never actually happened. Number two, at least for the bad segment, she probably lied. Now again, that Jessica line and Emily's emotional reaction might say there was some truth to it in an original draft, but I wouldn't be surprised if the only reason Emily said what she said is because that's what Matt wanted to hear in that moment. I mean, that's basically already the case in the final game, just not as blatant. He's emotionally caught up and Emily just says the right words that he wants to hear in that moment in order to hopefully see him safer. Again, Emily cheating is not confirmed with this dialogue. Was it thought about? Yes, but ultimately made canon? No. Last but not least, the by far most interesting talking points take place in the cut dialogue for the police interviews. They have always been a fan favorite segment as they showcase the characters after their traumatizing night and also reflect the events that were influenced by your choices. Hence the discovery of unused dialogue was really interesting because it actually confirmed that there were once 3 different paths planned that ultimately never made it. The Matt and Mike ones weren't so interesting, but the cut lines for Ashley and Chris confirm said 3 original planned scenarios. Chris has 2 different voice lines that both indicate 2 different things. On the one hand, he talks about shooting Ashley, which is crazy because if you shot Ashley under any circumstance in the original, whether you aim at her first or not, she usually won't let you in and you die. So the fact that he talks about it and is alive to do so means there was originally a way to still survive as Chris after making that choice. Probably what they originally always said, which is if Chris aims at him first and Ashley then tells him to shoot her, he obliges, but Ashley doesn't kill him. Given that never worked out in the original, this line also never made it, which is weird though because I thought it was just a bug or something. Or that it was the death's biggest regret. I guess given that this line was not used in the final game, it means it was attached to exactly the scenario, or like mentioned, just removed altogether because they also removed the possibility of surviving after shooting Ashley. How is it in the remake, by the way? Does she let you in after you first aim at yourself and then shoot her? I don't know, tell me. Secondly, also very interestingly, Chris talks about how he found Ashley's body without a head in the mines after saying he thought he heard Jess. This also confirms that a different scenario was once planned, as in the final game, Ashley dying to the trapdoor would always result in Chris dying if he also stayed behind. And the only way for Chris to find Ashley's beanie is by this exact scenario. Ashley dies, Chris finds her beanie, not her body, but then also always dies. So with this voice line, it's confirmed that there was a possibility for Chris to stay behind, Ashley to die, Chris to find Ashley, but to not get killed. Maybe because the Wendigo moved on and went back down the trapdoor? It's just really interesting because the Wendigo actually drags Ashley into the trapdoor with it, though I believe that only happens of course when they're with the group. I'm not sure. Either way, another voice line that clearly confirms a differently possible path that was ultimately scrapped for uncertain reasons. Because not only did he find her full headless body, but also lived to tell the tale. And last but not least, Ashley talks about how Mike and Sam went down to look for Josh, but never came back. That is insanely interesting. She always said that part about them going to find Josh, but not that they never made it back, which heavily implies that originally there was a potential scenario where Sam and Mike do not always make it to the lodge. Their infamous plot armor always made it so that they 100% make it to that final showdown no matter what. This line makes you think otherwise, because the way she says it's clear that Ashley's the one that always went back to the lodge and not that they just split up and didn't meet again. Like, she wouldn't say this unless they didn't make it back. Very, very interesting, because this is one of the biggest what if scenarios in the game. So much has to change for this to be a possibility. Early endings would have to be possible and such things. To think there was a point where they weren't always the last one standing is pretty damn cool. Alright, my voice, my poor voice, I think that is it. Yeah, I think we reached the end of this way too long video. I really didn't expect to be able to talk this much about Until Dawn in 2024, but here we are. Cut dialogue, there was just some extra joke or not needed blood material, where some of it implies some big changes in production. What do you think? Tell me all about it down in the comments, leave a like, subscribe if you haven't yet. Look forward to another cool Until Dawn video highlighting camera hacks, mods and more that were not possible before the remake on PC, releasing sometime throughout this week. Thanks for watching and see you soon.